Good morning and welcome to Burns Bible Story for Kids. We do this each Friday morning at 11 o'clock. Just share a story with you. And we share from the Jesus Storybook Bible. It's my grandson Judah's favorite book, and he's let me borrow it so I can share stories with you. And today it's entitled God to the Rescue. And it's the beginning story of Moses. And we'll just get started. Joseph and his brothers grew old and died. Remember, we had done Joseph earlier, a couple of weeks ago. But their children's children stayed on in Egypt, where they became a very large family. Later on, a new king began to rule, but this Pharaoh didn't remember Joseph, and he didn't like God's people. He made them into his slaves and beat them and made them work harder and harder. God's people cried out to God to rescue them. And God heard them. He remembered his promise to Abraham that he would look after his people. He would find a way to set them free. One day, Moses was looking after sheep when something caught his eye. A bush that was behaving very oddly. It was on fire. But its leaves weren't burning up. So he took a closer look and he heard a big voice. Moses. Moses jumped back. The bush was talking to him. God said, I have heard my people's cries. I have seen their tears, so I have come down to rescue them. Go to Pharaoh and tell him to let my people go free. But Moses was afraid. But God had reminded him, I will be with you. So Moses went to Pharaoh. Pharaoh says, God? Never heard of him. But Moses kept going. God says, let his people go free. Pharaoh said, why should I? Don't want to. Won't. So he didn't. So God gave Pharaoh 10 warnings, called them plagues. And first, he turned the river Nile into blood. No one could drink the water, but Pharaoh still would not let his people go. So God made frogs come hopping and leaping and jumping. They're all over the place. In the bed there were frogs. In your hair there were frogs. In your soup there were frogs. All over, everywhere, frogs. Pharaoh screamed, make them go away, then your people can go. So God took the frogs away. But Pharaoh changed his mind. You can't go. So then God sent zillions of gnats. But Pharaoh still said no. So then God sent swarms of flies. Flies that buzz in your eyes, flies. And after that, sickness and horrible boils and huge hailstones and storms of locusts. Then darkness when it should have been day, until it seemed the whole world, creation and everything, was coming undone, falling back into darkness and emptiness and nothingness. But each time Pharaoh said, make it stop and they can go. And each time when God made it stop, Pharaoh changed his mind and said, actually, no, you can't go. Finally, Moses warned Pharaoh, obey God or he will have to send the worst thing of all. And Pharaoh just laughed. So God said, the oldest boy in each family of Egypt must die, but my people will be safe. God told his people to take their best lamb to sacrifice it and put some of its blood on their front doors. When God passes over your house, God will see the blood and know that the lamb died instead of you. That's what Pharaoh had told him. That night, just as God had said, suddenly piercing the darkness, echoing down the corridors of the palace, came a blood-curdling scream. Pharaoh's oldest son had passed away. At last, Pharaoh did just what God had said. Get out. Just go. And so that very night, Moses and God's people fled out of Egypt and out of slavery. They were free at last. God's people would always remember this great rescue and call it Passover. But even a greater rescue was coming. Many years later, God was going to do it again. He was going to come down once more to rescue his people. But this time, God was going to set them free forever and ever. Thanks so much for joining me for Burns Bible Story for Kids. We hope you will join us again next Friday morning at 11 o'clock right here on Facebook Live on KCBI's Facebook page. And hope you have a great weekend.